All right, guys, welcome back to the Natty Society podcast, where we talk all things about natural bodybuilding. I'm your host, Sim, and joining me is my co-host, Edmund.
Hey everyone.
Okay, today we have Dr. Eric Helms, and if you don't know him already, he is a WNBF pro bodybuilder, a bodybuilding coach, and also Chief Science Officer from Team 3DMJ. He has a PhD in sports science, and most importantly, people call him the Steve Rogers of natural bodybuilding. Why don't you say hi to everyone, Eric?
That is a very generous introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you both for having me on, and it is an honor and also a lot of fun to talk natural bodybuilding with you guys because I could talk about this all day. So thank you for having me.
Nah, the pleasure is ours. Right. So starting off, I wanna throw it to, I wanna throw a big why to Eric. I wanna ask, why is science important in your opinion?
That's a great question. And I think we really have to take a step back and think about what science is more broadly. And science is really just the way that we crazy monkeys have figured out to observe the world around us in a way that has helped society, right? The reason we can talk over Zoom right now, communicate across time zones, and see each other, even though we're in physically different locations, is because of the process of observation, experimentation, and study. So science is not something that happens outside of who we are, only by specific scientists, only in labs, only by universities. Science is something that we all do. It is the process of observation and experimentation and just doing it in a controlled manner so that we can get closer and closer and closer, especially if we're talking about quantitative research, understanding how things work. So even those of us who don't really think that we're science based and we are just, you know what? I just want to see what successful bodybuilders do. I'm not worried about all those nerds. And you know what? I do what works for me. Whether you like it or not, you're kind of participating in a little bit of science there yourself. You're trying to look at repeated observations. You're trying to see what seems to be repeatable, and good coaches have great pattern recognition. They know to change one variable at a time. They know that things work differently in different situations. And whether they realize it or not, they probably have a principle-based understanding of certain things. They might know that higher doses of training tend to produce higher results, but too much produces some fatigue. They might understand that, hey, if we lift heavier, you'll get stronger, but it doesn't necessarily make you bigger. Some people need to change exercises, and these exercises are better for these biomechanical reasons. They understand about what protein is and how it breaks down into amino acids, and whether or not they've read a study in the last year doesn't matter because some of the things that we now consider common knowledge were actually things that we studied 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they've become common knowledge because we've incorporated them into our understanding of things. So science is the process of learning and understanding. It is just kind of what we call it. And for me, science is incredibly important for my personality because I have to not just know what to do, I need to know why to do it, or I can't buy in. So there's a funny story that my mom always tells of how she lost me when I was young at a magic show. There's all these kids sitting in front. There's a magic show. Oh, where's my son? She freaks out for a second and she looks over, and there's little Eric looking behind the stage, trying to figure out how the guy's doing the magic show. And there's another
Wow.
story she tells of where she goes and she's crying to my father when they were still married and when he was still alive because I didn't believe that Santa Claus delivered the presents. And I was like, no, you guys put them there and you guys ate the cookies. And she never got the experience of getting me to actually believe in Santa Claus and getting to have that typical Christmas parent experience of your kid getting excited and asking Santa what they want. So I think it's also important for me just to state my biases. I'm not someone who has the ability to accept things just because, and for me to be invested in anything from an emotional perspective, I have to understand why and I have to understand how it works. It needs to make sense to me. And I think that doesn't appeal to everybody. but it's the way my brain works, and it's the way a lot of people's brains work, at least on things they're interested in. So when I began as a bodybuilder, which was a transformative, positive experience for me,
Mm.
there was no way for me not to become a nerd about it as well, because anything I'm interested in, I want to know how it works. I want to understand everything about it. And for me to make decisions, especially when the traditional wisdom stopped working for me, of just work harder, just do this, just follow these meal plans, just do what the magazines say. Well, how did I decide what I needed to do? Who would I listen to? Um, some people I would trust and respect and know who were, bigger than me or been in the game longer. They tell me to do things like, oh, so why would I do that? And if they couldn't explain it to me, that wasn't a satisfactory answer. So it's to some degree just the way I'm wired. Like when I was playing Street Fighter 2 during COVID, I was need to look up frame data, and I wanted to understand like, okay, well, hold on. So how does the mechanics of this work? Like, how do you do a grab, and does the block work? And like so, I take a almost a quote unquote scientific approach to everything I do. It's just kind of the way I operate.
Damn.
Nice.
You've been a little scientist since you were young.
Since
Because you're just curious. You're just so curious about all things, right?
I'm to some degree a bit of a natural skeptic, which is not always a good thing. you know? Like sometimes my wife will just want to share something with me that she heard on Instagram or on social media and be like, "Oh, isn't this cool?" And I go, "But is that actually the way it works?" And it's like, I have to read the room sometimes, She'll be
Right.
like, "Oh, look at this cool thing." And she's trying to connect with her husband. We're going on a walk in the morning and my dumbass is like, "Well, I got to fact check that shit."
Oh, she got connected to Dr. Eric Helms instead.
Yeah, so she made the mistake of putting the ring on me, and now she's got to have give me that unconditional love. Not that I don't try to think about those things, but
Right.
yeah, like I just if things don't make sense to me immediately, I need to understand why. And so in retrospect, thinking about my personality, it's no surprise that I pursued something. And I'm also very, very single-minded and I get very obsessive. And the thing I'm interested in is pretty much all I can think about. So once I got bit by the iron bug with just having this kind of natural level of skepticism,
Mm.
um, now I have a sports science degree and two master's degrees, and all I do is lift weights all day. So yeah.
Mm, very interesting. Right, Eric. We would love to know what are the fundamental of hypertrophy.
Yeah. And the funny thing is you would think like that would be the first thing that we would have figured out, answered, and we would know very definitively. And you know, when you do a PhD in a topic, I think sometimes we look to doctors, and this gets us in trouble as a society. We assume they just know everything. Like okay, cool. Like you're a doctor, you write a diet book, great. That now you've solved all our problems. But how many times have there been kind of these charlatan-based doctors who have written, another diet book that leads us astray? Um, Now that's kind of an MD, but a PhD specifically is one where you dive deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into a single topic and you become an expert in that. And to get to the doctorate, you do need to become a generalist in the broader field per se. So if you were to ask me general questions about exercise science, nutrition, strength and conditioning, I would be able to give you decent answers. But if you were to start talking to me specifically about, okay, what's the best program or approach or nutrition for an endurance athlete, I would very quickly tell you, hey, this is not my area, you know. Um,
Mhm.
so that needs to be understood in a broader sense that there are always more levels to the depth of your understanding. So I could tell
Right.
you that after you are done maturing and you're an adult,
Mhm.
and if you are drug free, that hypertrophy is caused by tension and mechanotransduction at the fiber level that we supply through resisting something and providing a sufficient dose of tension on our muscles that will make us grow. That is true. But then you might have the question, well, what type of tension? To what degree? How much? Where is it sensed? And why?
Mm.
And those are still questions we're answering. But at the very basic level, we can say that the initiating event that causes hypertrophy is creating tension at the muscle fiber, or even smaller level at the sarcomere, which is the smallest contractile unit. So it is mechanical tension. But if you just say that, then people go, okay, well, what is mechanical tension? Because sometimes, even just 15 years ago, people think, oh, then I got to lift heavy. And I go, well, not
Mm.
necessarily. And then you have to explain that next level. But it was actually, I think, either Goldspink in the 70s that pretty much was able to identify using animal models and stretching that, hey, if we put tension on muscle, it hypertrophies in response to it. Now, it's a confusing mess, though, because, all right, does taking anabolic steroids produce tension? No, but it produces growth. And that's why I had to give you that caveat. After maturation, once sex hormones and sex specific hormones have done putting us through our puberty and we're finished growing, additional growth, specifically and only of muscle, is coming from that tension stimulus. And if you are taking anabolic steroids, a good way to think of it is that you're essentially inducing a little bit more puberty in the person. And
Right.
that's why many of those side effects that we see from anabolic hormones are they're androgenic. That's why they're called anabolic androgenic steroids, because they don't just create anabolism. So, for example, if you are a female and you take a high enough dose and you are susceptible to certain side effects, even one time you do a steroid cycle, it's not uncommon to have your voice change because there are sex-specific changes that occur during puberty that modify your voice box and change the depth of your voice that we see when men on average have deeper voices than women, just as an example.
Mm.
So,
So,
what,
what are some of the misconceptions like in terms of between strength training and hypertrophy?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to that whole thing with mechanical tension, right?
Right.
So some people, I think that the first time this was in the modern era really communicated by a science communicator would be Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. Actually, for his graduate work, he did a paper that was published in 2010, The Mechanisms of Hypertrophy. And that's been updated multiple times. He's written many papers since then, but it was presented as, okay, we have mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage as a proposal, a hypothesis, importantly, not a definitive declarative statement of, hey, we've got it all figured out. And some of the interpretations of that, well, okay, then we need to do periodized training for bodybuilders or anyone who wants to get bigger. We need to do some heavy lifting for mechanical tension. We need to do some low rest period, high rep supersets, near to failure to produce a whole lot of metabolic stress, which is essentially just what occurs in muscle when it has to rely on anaerobic glycolysis, when you have to do a lot of contractions and you build up a lot of metabolites and you don't have a sufficient, you can't use the oxidative system to do that. So in a lack of the presence of oxygen, you have to use this other energy system. These metabolites accumulate. You can't do it forever. And maybe that helps growth, maybe. And then finally, we also got to actually damage the fiber if we want to see satellite cell proliferation, dissemination, and the addition of more fibers and fiber splitting and all kinds of cool stuff. Maybe. So I think one of the main misconceptions is that because mechanical tension is an important or the initiating thing that stimulates growth, that therefore bodybuilders should be lifting heavy at least sometimes. And the reason why that's not necessarily true is because of the way that tension, quote unquote, is sensed. And that is sensed at the fiber level. And what is actually going on to cause muscle growth is what's called mechanotransduction, which is just a really fancy nerd way of saying turning the actual process of mechanical work, lifting weights or moving or contracting or trying to contract and generating that tension into a chemical signal that creates the cascade of responses in the cell that initiates a higher muscle protein synthesis that results in a accrual of muscle tissue beyond what we're always trying to lose on a day-to-day basis. And this is always happening because if you think about it, if you send a man or a woman into space, one of the things that they're trying to combat immediately is muscle loss because they're now not in a gravity well. So we're always under some degree of tension. And if we all lived on another planet and we were aliens that had twice the gravity of Earth, everybody would be a little bit more jacked, right? And likewise, if we all lived on a planet that had a quarter of the gravity or half the gravity or no gravity, we would see a significant degree of atrophy. And in space, they do things like training with elastic bands or inertial flywheels or even new technology that's been developed that is electromagnetic resistance because, you know, nothing has weight. It has mass, but not weight. So,
Right.
you know, you can get the initial push and then the weight just floats away from you, or more likely, you weigh more than that, you float away. So, how do I do this? You know, so even though they're doing flywheel training and elastic band training and maybe even some new technology, you know, this electromagnetic resistance, the other 23 hours of the day, they're losing muscle, right?
Right.
So, us in a gravity well, it's this hour per day or 2 hours per day where we're trying to create this tension stimulus. We think, okay, we got to go heavy. Heavy is better. Well, that's not actually the way things work. You can lift heavy, and maybe you choose your 5 RM load, and you can only do 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 reps with it. To lift that load because it's so heavy requires you to recruit all of your muscle fibers. All of your motor units are active, even your high threshold motor units, which recruit the more powerful, fast type 2 fibers to meet that force demand, to overcome that external load. High tension, right? Yes. But why is it that you can also grow doing 30 to 40 reps to failure? And we see examples of bodybuilders who have trained exclusively light or really, really heavy. And why are powerlifters so big? And also track cyclists have huge quads. What's going on there, right?
Right.
Well, the thing is that if you take a light load all the way to failure, at the very smallest level, that sarcomere, the smallest unit of contractile tissue within an individual muscle fiber, that is where tension is actually sensed. And if you go to failure on a set, not every single one of your fibers can keep going. As we talked about earlier, metabolic stress, right? So that is that anaerobic glycolysis, you're generating all these metabolic byproducts, pH is dropping. You can't do that forever. That is happening and is part of fatigue. So as fatigue occurs, certain fibers can no longer keep producing force. So then your body has to figure out a strategy to keep meeting the force demand. So it cycles in another motor unit and recruits other fibers. And then as more fatigue keeps happening, it keeps trying to do this. And eventually, when you do a set of 30 to failure, you get to the same place as if you did a set of 6 to 8 to failure, even though it's a lot lighter, that every single one of those fibers is given all they can. And tension is actually sensed all the way inside down at that smallest level. So we have actin and myosin grabbing onto each other, creating contractile force. But what actually stabilizes them within the cytoskeleton is titin. It's a big protein molecule which unwinds during contraction. And not only does it help create this passive tension, it's also what's called a mechanosensor. So mechanotransduction requires mechanosensors to sense the tension, to create the chemical process. And titin is one of many mechanosensors that we have. We also have costomeres, or focal adhesions, which connect fibers laterally. So that when we produce force, it propagates across all of the muscle fibers around it, so we get efficient force production. And even the myonuclei themselves, the nuclei, the nucleus that's in the cells, there's multiple nuclei in every single muscle fiber, which makes muscle cells so cool. When those contract and are stretched, they actually flatten the nucleus a little bit, and that is actually sensed, and it's another mechanosensor. And there's a bunch of these. There's calcium gates. There's a ton in the membrane of different parts of the tissue. We're still learning all the ways that we sense tension and why perhaps stretching without a contraction or even activation of a muscle fiber can produce growth, and why blood flow restriction training can produce growth, and why regular resistance training, whether it's 30 reps or 5 reps, can produce growth. So this is kind of what I was getting to earlier, is I can say it's mechanical tension, but then as we go, okay, well, what different types of tension? So one of the biggest misconceptions is you need to lift heavy to produce growth. And the reality is that you need to train with a high degree of effort. And what I mean by that is you need to train either heavy or reasonably close to failure. So you get to the point where all of your fibers have to give a sufficient amount to experience tension.
And wouldn't that, so you said either heavy or relatively close to failure,
Yep.
regardless. You can, that means you can do a lighter weight, higher reps, close to
hmm
failure,
Yep.
but doesn't that mean you need to spend more time going through just to get to the same results?
Yes. And I'll give you an example of how this plays out. So if you were to take a very light load, we'll say 30% of 1 RM. This is not fun, by the way. We're talking on average, you need to do like 60, maybe 40 to 50 reps with 30% of 1RM to get close to failure.
Wow.
If you were to use a tourniquet or a blood pressure cuff, or even if you're
Mhm.
just a bro, knee sleeves, tighten those suckers up,
Mhm.
it would restrict the ability for venous blood flow to get out, but arteries are still delivering blood in. Blood pooling increases, metabolite accumulation increases, hypoxia is higher, anaerobic glycolysis is even more dependent because now you're restricting oxygen delivery to the muscle. You're probably now only going to get, say, 2/3 of those reps. And if you keep it on during the rest period and you do your next set, it's going to drop off a lot. But you'll get to the same place. So you might have done only 2/3 of the reps in total across 4 blood flow restricted sets with 30% of 1RM, compared to just going to failure with 30% of 1RM. And it'll
Mhm.
hurt more doing the BFR because you're doing those things. But you'll get the same growth, even though you did less mechanical work, because you're essentially inducing fatigue earlier with
Mhm.
that. So, yes, you have to do a lot of additional work to get to the point of hitting failure. So, does that mean higher load sets are more efficient? Yes, but you also have to use a higher load set. And if we look at studies on injury rates and say powerlifters and weightlifters, they're 2 to 4 times as frequent as they are among bodybuilders. Not just
Mhm.
because they're lifting higher loads, also they must snatch, they must do clean and jerks, they must squat, bench, and deadlift. While if you or I go to the gym and my shoulder's feeling a little wonky on bench, I can grab dumbbells. A powerlifter can
Right.
too, but there's a certain requisite degree of benching they must do, and they must go heavy. You know, so um, you can only do so much heavy training. Also,
Mhm.
heavy training it's not more fatiguing if we're talking about the kind of fatigue we've been talking about thus far that coincides with metabolic stress, but it is putting higher tissue strain for each rep through you. So there are going to be days where you have load thresholds that you can work with. And while it might be more efficient from a fatigue perspective to do a whole bunch of 6 to 12 rep training, what if your knee hurts and you want to do leg extensions? And doing 8 to 12 reps just doesn't feel as good as doing 15 to 20. And you can actually push yourself harder doing sets of 15 to 20. So I think it is to the bodybuilder's advantage to know that they can use both high loads and low loads. And we want to think about the combinations of exercise selection, load,
Mhm.
and then the necessity of proximity to failure. Because you can train even moderately heavy and you don't really need to worry about going to failure. But once you start doing, say, 15 reps plus, you don't need to necessarily go to failure, but you do need to get to the point where you're having some involuntary slowing of reps and you're getting close enough to failure to make sure that you've actually stimulated enough fibers.
Right. Cool. Would you say that in terms of programming, so we're deciding between higher loads and lower loads, compound or non-compound or isolation, is there a difference between a more advanced lifter, I should say bodybuilder, more advanced bodybuilder versus a more novice bodybuilder?
Absolutely. So a bodybuilder needs to be kind of a jack of all trades and but not necessarily a master of any of them like a strength athlete does. And novices are still in that learning phase to some degree. Um, Now, this is important because we have research on kind of the time course of adaptation. So, if we can all remember back to when we first started lifting, we probably saw our strength increase by like 100% at least in the first year. If you think about the very first time you benched, like what was it? And then a year later, how much were you benching? You probably got to a point where you're doing the same load for the same number of reps, doubled almost. I think first time I did bench, I was maybe doing like 115, like the 35 pounds or the 15 kilos on there for sets of
Right.
5 to 6. Now for sets of 5 to 6, I can probably do 120 kilos, So now that's many years later. I wasn't that strong just in the first year, but we get a lot stronger. We get a lot bigger in our first year, but that's not all due to strength. Or rather, that strength is not all due to muscle size. A lot of it is learning the motor pattern and becoming a more skilled lifter. And when we look at the time course of that adaptation, there was a pretty cool study that was done in the 90s with untrained women over 20 weeks. And they looked at strength and hypertrophy adaptations at the pre-test, the 10-week mark, and the 20-week mark. and they were doing bench press, leg press, and bicep curls. The really interesting thing was that they increased their bicep size and strength at the 10-week mark, but they'd increase their leg press and bench press strength, but not their quadricep or trunk muscle size at the 10-week mark, indicating that these multi-joint movements that are a little more complex, they required coordination between multiple joints and the muscles that move them. They had to actually learn how to do those movements before they could really start to stimulate the muscles and load it heavy enough to where it was a true challenge, that they weren't experiencing, quote unquote failure just because they couldn't control the weight anymore. So a novice would do well to learn the quote unquote basic compound lifts, like getting your basic squat pattern, deadlift pattern, press pattern, pull patterns, horizontal and vertical. And the reason being is that these translate to a lot of other skills. The more complex basic skills are going to help you in other things. So there's actually another great study on untrained individuals by Rossi and colleagues, where they had folks doing either all of their volume from squats, all of their volume from leg press, or half of their volume from leg press and squats. And a really interesting thing happened is at the end of this, I think it's an 8-week study, the groups that did more squatting got stronger at squats. So the best gains in squat 1RM were from the group that did all of their volume from squats, then slightly good, almost as good when they did half of it, and then not very good when they only did leg press. But the leg press gains were the same in everybody. Because the leg press, it doesn't take as much coordination or balance. You get on a leg press, you just push as hard as you can. So squatting seemed to transfer almost perfectly to leg press strength. But leg press strength had a big drop off. It didn't transfer as well to squatting because it's a more complex task. You have to balance. You have to coordinate more. You have to navigate your center of mass, right? So that's a great example of why I'm a big fan of kind of your more basic compound focused training for novice bodybuilders, because I think it gives them a broad skill base to then expand. And another thing to consider about the difference between a novice and an advanced bodybuilder, and we're also just talking about a novice versus advanced lifter, because some people will lift for years and get into bodybuilding, and yes, it's their first season, but they've been lifting a long time, and they may be very muscular and very advanced in terms of how they move in the gym. But if we're talking about someone who's been lifting for a year versus 10 years, they're going to be a lot stronger after 10 years, okay? And to some degree, we don't think about that and how it impacts the body and our exercise experience. So yes, at the 1 year mark, let's say you can squat 225 or 100 kilos. And at the 10-year mark, let's say you can squat, how about 227 kilos or 500 pounds, okay? In both cases, you might prescribe, I want to do 6 to 8 reps with 80% of 1RM. And that will be a similar proximity to failure if it's the same person in their training career, right? But there's going to be far more energy expenditure in the latter example, because we still have to physically do the work, right? And if we want to predict the energy expenditure from exercise, well, that's a complex task. An interesting thing is that the tonnage, the sets times reps times load, scales linearly with the energy expenditure. So if you want to figure out whether or not this session probably burned more calories than that session, it's basically just the volume, because you have to physically move it, distance times load and times the number of reps, right? That is the work that you're actually doing. So when you've gotten a lot stronger and you're doing a compound lift and you're moving now heavy absolute loads, you're going to feel more fatigued, even though you're at the same proximity to failure. You can especially see this in endurance athletes. If you've ever worked in like a strength conditioning world, they're not that strong, but they're competent with the movement pattern. They don't have a lot of muscle mass, and they're not doing a lot of high weights, and they have an incredible endurance because they've been training for endurance. And they'll do like a set of 10 to failure on leg press. They'll be ready to go in a minute, and they can almost replicate it. But if you take a bodybuilder and have them do a set to 10 to failure on a leg press, they need some rest, right? Especially if they're strong. So some things really do change, even at the same relative load when you're deeper into the game. This is something I really did learn working with a lot of powerlifting clients and also competing in powerlifting myself, is that, that's why sometimes it makes a little more sense to do something like a pendulum squat or a Smith machine squat and not try to get all of your volume through like free weight compound multi-joint lifts, especially as you get stronger and if you're quite competent, or it can really just take a toll and make the training very challenging.
Mhm. Sorry, Eric. So we heard this term periodization.
Mm.
How does it work, and how is it applicable to athletes, both in bodybuilding and powerlifting?
Yeah, so periodization is sometimes a kind of almost a mystical term for people because it gets talked about in a lot of complex terminologies, and some of the ways that people suggest periodizing have terms like, the undulating conjugate, you know, um, nonlinear. People will talk
Non-linear, yeah.
about, yeah, exactly, transmutation, even phases, and stuff has been translated from Russian, and it can be very confusing and kind of overwhelming to a trainer. But periodization is actually quite simple when you think about it. It is simply breaking your training up into phases or periods for the purposes of seeing enhanced performance over time. And the idea is that for a given performance in a given athlete, so periodization, that means need to be very different for a soccer player versus a power lifter, right? Or a swimmer, that the order matters, supposedly. That's the theory, right? So we'll take your typical power athlete, and I'll speak in generalities, and then we'll talk about bodybuilders and powerlifters. Your typical athlete, they're going to be moving a small implement, like a ball or a stick or a bat, or themselves through space as powerfully as possible, power being force times velocity. And that power is going to be specific to the velocities that they're going to be competing at. So the heavier the objects they're moving or the bigger the athlete, it's going to be more force dominant. The smaller the object, more velocity dominant. So the theory typically is that, okay, I want to build work capacity and muscle size, so I have more contractile tissue. So I'm having a hypertrophy and muscular endurance phase. And then I want to make that muscle really, really strong. I want to quote unquote transmute this muscle size into something that is good for producing force. So now I'll train hypertrophy and muscular endurance. I'm going to train strength, slow strength. I'm going to get really, really strong. And now with bigger muscles that produce a lot of force, now I want to get good at moving powerfully. So hypertrophy, quote unquote, potentiates strength training, which quote unquote potentiates power training.
Mm.
That's the basic idea of most periodization protocols. But here's the problem with it. Periodization is often in reference to long-term training. Like, oh, I have a 4-year plan for the Olympics. Or, oh, I've got, a competition I want to peak for in 6 months, right? Almost all the studies on periodization, though, however, are between like 6 to 24 weeks. So we don't really have any periodization research. What we really have is what we would describe as programming research. So we know what happens across a couple of mesocycles. A mesocycle is a block, typically about a month of training, all with the same kind of focus, all in one of those same phases, hypertrophy, strength, power, right? So we don't really know a lot about how long-term periodization actually works. We just know that people theorize that that's a good way to go about it. Another thing is that when we do have a study on programming, probably not periodization, that shows a periodized protocol is better than a quote unquote non-periodized protocol, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, how do we operationalize those terms as researchers? So what we might see in periodization and the basic structure that I talked about, going from hypertrophy to strength to power, is one where you start with lower intensities, sorry, higher volumes and lower loads, right? And then as you go through this block, you reduce the volume, increase the load, and then eventually what you're doing is only a small volume of high power activities. But let's talk about powerlifters now, okay? For them, power is actually strength, right? They don't need to throw something really far. They need to move a load as heavy as possible. So it is basically you're removing the power phase and just doing a taper, right? You're doing a very low volume of highly specific, high load work because you're trying to do something specific. That's principal specificity right before you compete. And you also want to have a low fatigue state so you have a high level of readiness so you can perform on the platform well. So a periodization model for a power lifter would be, okay, I need to build muscle in the muscles that are going to perform the squat, bench, and deadlift. And then as I get closer and closer to the competition, I need to do more and more competition-specific work. So I might move from doing variations of the big three to the competition versions to then doing singles on them and then dropping my volume, doing a taper, and getting on the platform. And the idea is I need bigger muscles, then I want to train them specifically, need to dump fatigue, make sure I don't get hurt, get on the platform, kill it, right?
Mm.
So when we have these studies that test kind of that protocol, they might do something like starting with sets of 8 to 12, and then moving to sets to 6 to 8, and then moving to sets of 2 to 4 before then doing a 1RM test. And what they would compare it to make it a fair comparison in the research, would be a volume equated protocol. So we know it's not just the effect of doing more work. And then they have no variation. There's no change. That's quote unquote non-periodized. So let's say this group they're comparing to is always training 6 to 8 reps, okay, from the very start to the very end. And then we see, oh, look at that. The group that did the periodization got a higher 1RM. Well, is it actually due to periodization, or was it due just to the act of changing? Was variation itself a good thing? Which it might be, because we see that highly monotonous training that doesn't change, that's always hard, like always doing a 6 to 8 RM, seems to be related to burnout, higher incidences of like upper chest respiratory tract infections in athletes, more incidences and signs of overreaching, so being a little beat up by your training. And then additionally, just the act of doing a 2 to 4 RM before doing a 1 RM compared to a 6 to 8 RM could be driving that difference, right? Because that's more specific, a 2 RM to a 1 RM than a 6 RM to a 1 RM. So is it really periodization per se, or is it that process of specificity and variation? And you can have variation that is not necessarily following a periodized model. So that's another limitation of the research, is we're not sure exactly what's driving periodization. So to get to bodybuilders now, we don't really have periodization studies on bodybuilding or hypertrophy training, because the entire model of periodization came from your more traditional sports where there's a performance, right? You were jumping. If you're a track athlete, you're sprinting, you're doing a snatch, you're doing a squat, you're getting on the basketball court, right? So for a bodybuilder, essentially, there's no reason to train with periodization in a traditional sense. You're not interested in these adaptations, right? You're essentially just looking at one phase of periodization, the hypertrophy phase. So it's very easy to make an argument that traditional periodization probably doesn't apply here and shouldn't. But that doesn't mean that there aren't principles from periodization that might be helpful. So, like I talked about, variation in and of itself seems to be a pretty good thing, right? It can avoid overreaching. It seems to be better from a perspective of staying mentally engaged and intentional, and being able to sustain your training for a longer period. Additionally, there are some data that indicate, instead of just staying in a narrow hypertrophy range of, let's say, 8 to 12 reps, that training in a broader rep range, regardless of how you do it, whether you do it in the same session, on different days, or in different blocks, or even in different weeks, seems to be better than just training 8 to 12. So we've seen pyramid systems that range from, like 15-10-5 versus 12-10-8 that lean in favor of producing more hypertrophy. We see a daily undulating model where you do a high rep day, a low rep day, and a moderate rep day, better than only having moderate rep days. Not statistically significant, but still leaning in that direction. And we see that interspersing hypertrophy blocks with strength blocks has actually resulted in greater hypertrophy to a small degree in one study as well. And that may be related to those factors I talked about earlier. Sometimes training heavy or training light is not a great thing to do on certain exercises, on certain days, if you're having joint discomfort, personal preference. Or there could even be slightly different signaling cascades at a more microscopic level, or even different muscle fibers that are being slightly favored by high rep training compared to moderate and low rep training, to where you might get slightly better aggregate hypertrophy by having a little more variation in terms of your reps. But you don't need to have that linearity where you're reducing volume and increasing intensity. Hypertrophy training is actually, it's more like trying to get a physiological adaptation than it is to try to get a performance outcome, right? So there's no such thing as task specificity for a bodybuilder. You can grow your bicep with an isometric contraction, or you can grow it with dumbbell curls, barbell curls. There's no such thing as an accessory exercise for a bodybuilder. Everything's a main lift if it makes you grow, right?
Right.
So essentially, bodybuilding is figuring out how to do as much as you can recover from at the highest intensity as much as possible, but without that being a negative, right? And that is the balance. Because if you try to do everything as hard as you can all the time with the highest frequency, you just have to deload every other day. And it's not and you can't sustain it or you get an injury. So that's why you see high intensity protocols that seem to be that some champions follow, high volume protocols, high frequency protocols, machine-based protocols, heavy protocols, light protocols. They all are different ways of getting to the same place. And none of them are necessarily better than the other, but there are more efficient and less efficient ways of doing it. So there are elements of periodization that bodybuilders should pay attention to. Fatigue management. You could argue that just simply having deloads is an element of periodization, right? Training across different rep ranges is an element of periodization. Varying your exercises is an element of periodization, right? But what you wouldn't do is go, okay, I need to do a taper, and okay, I need to train with, doubles and triples for, 2 full mesocycles or something like that.
Right. So, Eric, you mentioned about all those elements can be of a variation. Um, because a while ago, or a couple of years ago, or even until now, people are speaking of the optimal volume for a bodybuilder to train at for better hypertrophy outcome is between 10 to 20 sets. So that is a figure, a range for people to reference, not to say that you cannot train at 9 sets and you won't progress, or if you train at 21 sets, you will not be able to recover from. But now we do see that there is a controversy per se between relatively high volume versus relatively low volume. And I believe you are training at relatively higher volume, and you have another fellow coach or couple fellow coaches from Team 3DMJ who are training at relatively lower volume. And what's your take on this controversy?
Yeah, I think the controversy is largely invented or stemming from misunderstandings of what does the science tell us. And I think when people read like there's a recent meta regression that came out by Pelland and colleagues, great work that was done out of Florida Atlantic University. And they found that there were pretty clear positive relationships where you're getting more hypertrophy all the way up to about 30 sets per muscle group when counting them as fractional sets. So bench press would count as half a set for triceps, full set for chest as an example. But it is not an accurate interpretation to say that, okay, therefore, you should do 30 sets. Because we have to think about what is the actual question in the study and what do these studies tell us? And sometimes we ascribe meaning and interpretation to study that was never intended. So when we do a study, it typically lasts 2 to 3 months, right? That's how long, or the length of a semester. That's how long we can get the participants in, right?
Right.
We typically have them training 2 to 4 days per week because you have to have paid research assistants to be there, and the people have to have the time and energy to come in, okay? We're assessing hypertrophy probably at only 1 or 2, maybe 3 sites for the studies that were in this meta regression. There was about 35, I think, that were actually specifically looking at this outcome, hypertrophy, and I think over 1,000 participants. So it's actually a pretty clear finding. It's very hard to argue, but what people get wrong is they think that this applies to everyone all the time, or that it extends beyond how it should be interpreted. So we've got this 2 to 3 month long study where we're doing ultrasound measurements on the quad and the bicep. And I can tell you as a researcher, if I'm measuring the quad and the bicep, you better be damn sure that when I have these 3 different volume groups, high volume, moderate volume, low volume, that the thing I'm changing is their bicep and quadricep volume. And if I want to do this in trained participants, yeah, they get to do some rows and lat pull downs and some hamstring curls and calf raises and triceps and chest, but only enough to keep them in the study. And it's going to be the same amount in all 3 groups. Because what I really need to make sure that I see the differences is the thing I'm hypothesizing about. I think that different volumes will produce different degrees of hypertrophy in the muscles that I can measure. Okay. So what we really know from these studies, what the actual interpretation should be, is that if I said, hey, admin, Sim, if I want your quads and your biceps to be as big as possible in the next 10 weeks. And whichever one of you does it, I'm gonna take you out to a dinner or whatever restaurant you want, and you'll win too. You'll get bragging rights. What should you do? And the answer is pretty clear. As much as you can possibly do in the next 10 weeks, if that's all
Right.
you care about, right?
Right.
But I can tell you from running these studies, what happens is that a lot of the times, because they're being motivated by other research participants, sorry, research assistants, they're pushing to failure in most cases. They're crushing themselves. Some people do drop out, not everyone. It's
Mhm.
very, very hard training. You don't get the sandbag in these studies. And what naturally happens when someone tries to do 42 sets or 30 sets is they typically start performing at a lower quality of work or further from failure, whether they realize it or not. They start pacing themselves when they do a very high volume. And that's when they try to do it on every muscle group, not just two. But what we know from these studies is essentially that specialization cycles work. So these studies tell us that for 2 to 3 months, if you want a couple of muscles to grow really well, the more volume you can do to a point, and then it becomes uncertain, is probably going to be beneficial. They don't tell us that in perpetuity, forever, for a training career, that you should be doing for every single muscle group simultaneously 30 sets, and that everyone responds the same way, right? So
Right.
that's where the big missing perspective is. So the reason why we care about a meta-analysis with 1,000 people more than a single study with 20 is because of what's called sampling variation. All right. So a sample is a small group from a population, and a population is everybody from who that sample's from. So if that's trained lifters, the true one population that we actually can't ever know the answer from is everyone who lifts weights on the planet. So we're talking maybe 700 million people. All right. We got 1,000 of them. And fortunately, that's a big enough number that we can make some generalizations about the average response in that population. But
Mhm.
you're not a population, you're not a sample, and you're not an average. You're an individual. So some of my fellow coaches, they know from experience that for them, there is a certain amount of volume that starts to be counterproductive, that they can't sustain, either due to their lifestyle or that they shouldn't sustain. Like in the case of Jeff Alberts, he will tell you straight up, he's not currently trying to grow anymore.
Oh,
He's in his
wow.
mid 50s. He's been lifting
Okay.
since he was a teenager. His current protocol is what works best for his life, is definitely going to keep his muscle. He's not going to lose it. He talks about it all the time. You ain't going to lose muscle, right? It's
Right.
not the minimum to lose it, but he's trying to produce a robust stimulus to maintain all the hard work he's put in for the last 30 plus years of training, right? So
Mhm.
I'm doing something fundamentally different than Jeff, and I'm also a fundamentally different person. You know, he has experimented with high volumes, moderate volumes, low volumes. We've even trained together. And when I trained like Jeff, I actually lost a bit of size, fullness, and strength in my upper body while he was still making gains. This was way back in 2000, I think 11, 10 and 11, if I recall correctly. He could tell you
Wow.
about it. But it was a great experience because he showed me how to push it all the way to failure, even eccentric failure, and to then do partial reps and forced reps and things like that.
Mhm.
So I know how to train with a high intensity and a very high quality and not using momentum to initiate reps. Great experience. It wasn't as effective for me. I'm someone who does seem to respond pretty well to high volumes. So this relationship that we observe, it is the average. And it's really important to understand that the more you do, the less efficient that work is, right? You're going to get
Right.
far more out of the first handful of sets you do on a per set basis than the 28th, 29th, and 30th set. And there's also
Right.
uncertainty in this data. We don't have as many studies on 25 plus sets as we do on 6 to 15 sets. We have a lot of certainty when we're talking about, say, less than 25 sets. And, you know, Pellin and colleagues will tell you this, and they have a great podcast on data-driven strength if you want to listen to their podcast and really listen to a deep dive. Once you get up to that 30 set mark, though, that's kind of the point where the uncertainty is so high. And when they did a statistical analysis called a pairwise comparison, where they compared every single one of the sets in their prediction model, number of sets, to a lower or higher amount. Once they started comparing, say, 31 sets to 30, 29, 28, 27, it was no longer clear past 30 sets that there was a beneficial effect of higher volume. So
Mm.
even the average predictive response tells us that we don't know enough about really, really high volumes. We know enough about high volumes. Like I'd be confident in saying that if you took 10 samples from the population of trained lifters and you had 30 sets versus 10 sets, some of the studies would show no significant difference because of the diminishing returns and sampling variance. Just you wouldn't be able to see due to random noise that effect. But if you looked across the 10 studies, you would see a relatively clear signal to noise that 30 sets produce more hypertrophy than 10. Not to a great degree, but to probably a meaningful degree. But that doesn't mean you should do 30 sets all the time. And I think it's important to remember that I am someone who's been training 20 years, and I am competing in my first real pro season. I made my pro debut in 2023 at Worlds, but it was weeks after I turned pro. I didn't get to have an off season. So I brought the best package I had, and I placed seventh out of ninth, which is actually better than I thought I would do, especially at the pro middleweight stage. That's no joke, right? You guys saw
Right.
Oscar and Bada battling out.
Baba,
Whew,
Babacar.
excuse me. Yes, Inyang
Babacar.
Babakar.
Yeah.
That's probably two of the best bodybuilders in the world. I'm thinking, if the lineup that from 2023 had been there, Benjamin Schuster probably would have been
Right.
third, and he won. So this is that I'm trying to compete at that level. So that means I'm willing to do more time and effort invested to get marginal gains because I don't get to say, well, you know what, I could just do 15 sets and probably make the same gains in 2 years. Well, I need to be on stage in 2 years. So I'm trying to literally make as much progress as I can without hurting myself, burning out, or taking away from my life responsibilities and my values before I get on stage in 2025 because the goals we have are time bound. So I think a lot of the debates between high volume and low volume, especially if it's a science driven debate, someone is like, well, why wouldn't you just always do high volume? It's like the studies don't tell you to do high volume. They help us understand the relationship between volume and hypertrophy within the constraints of the studies we have, being basically specialization programs, being 2 to 3 months long, knowing that there are dropouts, knowing that we don't count the people who don't participate in the study. Once you tell them, hey, you could be randomized to a group that has 42 sets. Thanks. I'll see you next semester when you're doing a bicep curl study with creatine and I can get my free creatine. I'm not messing with 42 sets, right? For quads,
Right.
So there are notable limitations to the data. And the really big take home that we should know is that more volume does, on average, for most people, relative to whatever is low volume for them, produce more hypertrophy if they can recover from it, if they can sustain it, which they may not be able to do in the long term, and if it doesn't start working against them. There are some new take homes from this meta regression I think are worth discussing if you guys want. The
Sure.
prior hypothesis we had is that there's an inverted U, right? The idea that
Right.
you do more volume and eventually it plateaus, then you keep going, right? You're way past your MRV, as Mike Israetel would say, and you
Mhm.
are starting to actually get a negative effect from doing more volume.
Right.
And I used to be a little more cautious as a coach and as a science communicator and even as an athlete with high volume protocols because I was worried that I would like insidiously be actually growing slower.
Mhm.
And I think the one thing we can take from the recent meta regression is that that's probably not going to happen. If you are doing too much volume, it won't sneak up on you. You will know it, right? Because we see this increased uncertainty and this plateauing and diminishing returns. We have not yet observed the inverted U. It's possible we will with more high volume research, but the reality is that higher volumes will eventually create an inverted U for any individual. Even if it doesn't
Mhm.
happen at the 2 to 3 month mark. But if you try to do 30 sets for all muscle groups for 5 months, there's very few people who can do that without, oh, I have to deload all the time, or I'm having tendonitis, or I'm just burnt out and tired. It causes problems for most people. There's practical issues. I have too much lumbar soreness to do leg days without, changing my exercises. Or the most common thing I see as a coach is that someone tries to do high volume and they start dropping the quality of their training. And that's not
Right.
worth it because we're focusing on volume a lot right now, But remember that anytime we do a scientific study, and especially something like a regression, which is a statistical analysis to look at the
Mhm.
relationship between just two variables, the growth that occurs in these studies that give someone, say, 10, 20, or 30 sets is not just from the 10, 20, or 30 sets. If they didn't sleep, if they didn't eat any protein, they didn't eat any calories, if they starved themselves, regardless of which group they would be in, it would change how much they grew. We all know that, but it's like a magic trick, right? We only focus on the thing that's in front of us while the magician's doing something else over here. We start to lose sight of all the other variables that are involved. So that's why we do things like control for nutrition, control for protein, use the same exercises, control the rest intervals, control the loads. And volume does have an effect, but it's not the only thing that dictates hypertrophy. And in fact, you can look at the statistical model that Pellin and colleagues did, and you can see, okay, how much of the variation, the change in hypertrophy, is related to the change in volume? How much is there how much does one predict of the other? And it's about 25%, meaning that 3/4 of your gains are related to literally everything else besides volume. So it doesn't make sense
Mm.
if you try to do higher volume at the cost of other variables. So the way I gauge in a very practical sense of whether someone's trying to do too much volume is I want to look at the actual training. And Sim, you know this.
Mm.
I
Right.
want to see videos from the people I'm consulting with. I want to see, okay, you tell me what you think is a 9 RIR, sorry, a 9 RPE or a 1 RIR. Send me the video. And sometimes what you'll see is, okay, we tried to push the volumes and all of a sudden they think they're at 2 RIRs and now they're at 4 RIRs, right?
Mm.
And this is actually observable in endurance training. Um, when you give someone like a saline injection into their joints, which swells them up and gives you this acute sense of pain, they don't push as hard on a time trial. Okay.
Oh.
And even more basic than that is a marathon runner is not going to sprint coming out of the gates because they'll never finish the marathon. The marathon isn't a sprint. So when you think I have literally 20 sets to do on legs in this workout, it's few people who will go, sweet, let me go to a 2 RIR on my first set. Next set will be a 1 RIR. Next set will be failure. And now I got, oh, let me see, 17 more sets that are going to be close to failure. Some people can do it. Some people are absolute workhorses. They're adapted to it. They respond well to it. They have the mental fortitude for it. They've built up to it. They have the right exercise selection, RPE, and rep combinations to even facilitate making that happen. But in many cases, when you ask someone to do a high volume program, that increase in quantity comes at the cost of quality. And even if it's not the proximity to failure, you start to see them just try to go through the process of ticking those boxes like, oh shit, I got 20 sets to do. Let me just get through this set. But you're going to get the most out of your training when you are mentally present. You're controlling the eccentric, right? You're putting forth intent on the concentric. You're pushing close to failure. And you're making sure on multi-joint movements where you could shift the exercise to a different muscle group when you start to feel that pain or that burn or that fear of a heavy load on your fifth rep and you're not sure you're going to get it, to actually hold it to the fire and keep going. And that's something that you got to learn that skill and then keep it. And then you got to maintain that effort through a higher volume protocol. And everyone kind of has their point where they can't do that. And that's typically, in my mind, not a good trade-off. So first, you want to work on quality. First, you want to work on accurate RIRs, good exercise technique, good exercise selection, maximizing recovery. And then, if you're not progressing, and only then, that's when you might want to do more volume. And then you have to assess, did that increase in quantity come at the cost of quality? And if it did, then you have two choices. I need to dial back my quantity, or I need to somehow find a way to get the quality back up where it needs to be. And
Mm.
which is the right answer really depends upon the experience level of the athlete, what they respond well to, and if they even need it. So personally, I'm doing a very high volume because I respond well to it. Um, and I do have people looking over this. This isn't my own self-assessment of myself, but send training videos to Brian Miner. I've got, Jeff, who I train with, who's, the technician when it comes to this stuff, Berto. And I also put myself out there. Like anyone who follows me on Instagram, I put most of my, or at least a few sets of my training pretty much every day on there. And in my mind, I'm training in most cases, unless it's a heavy barbell lift, it is to failure or to 0 to 2 RIR. And anyone out there who sees me on Instagram, if you see me finish a set and you're like, that was like a 4 RIR, DM my ass. Let me know. Like, I put it out there for a reason. But that's not typically the DMs I get. The DMs I get are, so why do you use cables and why do you put it there? Like they're curious about the exercise I'm using. They're not calling me out on not training hard enough. And I've got a YouTube series. So I'm just trying to be better, and I don't have any attachment to high volume. I have too much shit to do. I don't want to do 20 to 30 sets per muscle group like I'm currently doing, Sim. It
Mm-hmm.
takes time, you know?
Right.
I got PhD students, I got seminars to do, I got books to write, man. I got mass articles to write, I got podcasts to do. I would love to respond really well to 6 sets, man. I wish I was a hit responder, but I'm not. I got to do what I got to do.
Right.
Eric, sorry, for the progression part, how do you monitor it in terms of are you progressing from your strength and performance in the training, or is it a visual thing? So how
Yes.
do you determine whether are you progressing in the right direction?
Great question. So there is absolutely the visual aspect of it. You just have to, when you've been lifting as long as I have. So for the listener who's not familiar with me, I'm turning 42 in April, and I started lifting in 2004. So I've been lifting for it'll be 21 years this year, and I am not a spring chicken. Let's say, I am possibly scraping at the last gains I will be able to make. Fortunately, I did spend a lot of time as a dual athlete competing in powerlifting, and I've had some really great gains in this last year, specifically only training for bodybuilding. Um, I love powerlifting. It definitely makes you bigger, and for 99% of the population, you can train for strength and hypertrophy and sacrifice nothing, because they're very complementary to one another. But for me, what I would need to do to get stronger in powerlifting would have taken away from what I needed to do to get better at bodybuilding, and not having I'm going to say fatiguing, but I really mean like musculoskeletal joint limitations of trying to do high volume, high load squats, bench, and deadlift on a regular basis. Removing that really enabled me to do more work and focus more on my weak points, and do better bodybuilding. So I'm making relatively noticeable progress, but even then, my stage weight might go up a couple kilos at most. So when you're only gaining 3 or 4 pounds of lean tissue over a year and a half, it's not something where you can step on the scale every week and be like, oh, nice, you know? Um, that would just be me getting fatter. But I do look for visual changes, and I also do get some anthropometry done. So high quality skin fold and circumference measurements done by my colleagues at AUT. And I do that maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And I'm kind of looking at, okay, what's my 10-day average body weight? And then what are my sum of 8 skin fold sites looking like? And then what are my measurements? Okay. I'm not trying to get a body fat percentage, because has a bunch of error in estimation in, but literally the actual millimeters on my 8 different sites in my body added together, which has much more precision. And then at what body weight am I at? And then what do I look like visually? But those visual assessments are few and far between, highly precise, and the main thing I'm looking at, admin, because drug-free growth as a
Right.
experienced lifter is essentially that I'm following the recipe. So you kind of have to think of yourself as a baker, or maybe as a farmer. It's not like being a power lifter where if your 1RM goes up on your squat, bench, or deadlift, you're doing something right and you can get feedback over the course of 2 blocks. It is more about, okay, am I following my nutrition plan? Am I getting my steps in? Am I eating enough fruits and vegetables? Do I have at least 3 protein servings per day? Is my protein high enough? Am I putting forth the RIRs that I think I am? Am I getting all my training done? And then does it seem to be causing some performance increase? And I don't mean increasing my 1RMs. I'm not testing my lat pull down 5 rep max or anything like that. But if I look back at my training logs from 3 months ago, am I able to do more sets, or sorry, more reps across all of my sets on most of my exercises, right? As an example, 2 weeks ago, I set a lifetime PR, a new 10 RM on RDL with 160 kilos. And that the last time I did a 10 RM was 155 kilos, and it was like 3 months earlier. So it's incremental progress that you have to look for. Sometimes it's, hey, across my 4 sets of behind the back cable curls, I was able to get more reps with 37.5 kilos than I was last block, you know? So
Mm.
the progression model that I follow is something that I describe as auto-regulated double progression. So a lot of people are familiar with double progression. It's just the idea of once you give yourself a rep range, let's say 8 to 15. Once I can get 15 on all of my sets, then I'm allowed or I'm supposed to increase load, and then I build back up from 8 to 15. It's a great progression model. The only thing that I don't like about it is that it's not super flexible. So auto-regulated double progression is just saying, okay, we'll also take an RIR range with that. And will allow you to jump around in those reps if you don't feel strong on one day or if you don't feel like you have good muscular endurance. So let's say I got 8 to 15 across 4 sets at a 0 to 2 RIR. Now, if I can hit the top of the rep range and the bottom of the RIR range on the first set, now I'm allowed to go up. So if I can do 15 reps with a given load at a 2 RIR, meaning I could have done 17 in my head, I think. Okay, that load I've pretty well mastered, and I can go up and load. And this allows for variations in performance on a day-to-day basis,
Mm.
and which happens, because there's kind of a black box on performance. There's fatigue, there's the stimulus, there's time. Are you in a deficit? Did you have a rough day? Did you get caffeine, etc.? But on average, eventually, if you're putting in enough stimulus, this is kind of that baker's analogy. You look in the oven and you're like, oh, yeah, it's getting a little golden brown on top. But you might still have to stick the fork in it and be like, oh, okay, sweet, it's not wet, it's ready. That you can't really see until you know. So it might be 4 or 5 weeks before you go, oh shit, I hit a PR. And as an advanced or even a late stage intermediate, you kind of have to just to accept the fact that you're going to have a lot of days where your performance is roughly the same. But if in the same conditions you're able to hit a PR this late in the game, like I've had a lot of good days in the last 3 months since I hit that 155 for 10 on RDL. But no matter how good a day was, I couldn't do 160. So the fact that I was able to do 160 in any condition at this body weight, like I'm not heavier, I'm actually lighter. I'm doing my last cut. That's like, okay, I'm not any better at RDLs. I'm in lifting for 20 years, right? Something has grown. I must have more contractile tissue. Something is enabling me to get 10 reps at 160. And also I'm seeing it's trickling down into other movements. So that's kind of how you have to look at it is your aggregate performance across repetition ranges and various exercises. And that's your principal gauge of whether or not you're on the right track and whether your training program is being effective, especially as a drug-free bodybuilder, especially as you move into the late stage, intermediate, and advanced stage.
Mhm.
Cool. Awesome. So, Eric, today we specifically try to center all our topics revolving around training.
Mm.
But because potentially we want to trick you into coming back to our podcast sometime in the future again. Would you be down to do it?
I am I'm very trickable. You can trick me into coming back as many times as you guys want. I would love it. You might not even have to trick me. I'd probably be happy to do it without being tricked. Yeah.
Right, right, right. So on an ending note, I would love to have you, Dr. Eric Helms, to give some advice to aspiring coaches who are looking to make an impact in the evidence-based fitness space, or to the athletes who are trying to follow an evidence-based approach in their own training.
For sure. I think the biggest thing you want to do is remember that while science is important, it is more than just kind of what is being talked about in the evidence-based community. It goes all the way back to what I said earlier. It's just a way of thinking. It's a philosophy. And the underlying philosophy of science is one where we need to actually observe and test things. We want to change one thing at a time. It's the process that's more important than the actual outcomes, right? So you don't have to be someone with a PhD to take a scientific approach, but you do have to think about, okay, how do I control for the variables that I'm interested in? And then how do I manipulate one thing so that I actually know what was cause and effect, right? I mean, I remember when I was a young man back in the day, and I'm going to age myself here. I go to GNC, a physical supplement store, right? Not just
Right.
ordering it online.
Right.
And the guy behind the counter tells me, "Oh, bro, no explode. It's gonna blow up your body, man." I started training with it, followed a high protein diet, took no explode. I got huge. My first thought is, well, how do you know it wasn't the high protein diet or the new training plan, right? You
Right.
don't, right? So that's an example of not following an evidence-based approach. So how do we actually know what we know? And if you think about that and you think about the approach you take that needs to be methodical, specific. You need to have reasons for it. And you need to not extrapolate beyond what you can know. Be comfortable not knowing what you don't know. That's the most important thing. Be curious and then take that systematic scientific approach. Even if you're not that comfortable with the science, like I said, you can get a lot just from what seems to work well and basic principles. Bodybuilders have not needed sports scientists to be huge, you know. Before the dawn
Mm.
of sports science, there was amazing physiques. We can refine things. We can help people do things more efficiently. But, there have been jacked people way before, Matt Bev started talking
Mhm.
about periodization in the 60s, right?
Right.
Before you could get a PhD in sports science. So put it in the right, proper place. There's many more important things than you fully understanding research. Coaching is about relationships. Coaching is an art. It's about helping people achieve their goals. It's not about you as a coach. Yes, you need to have an understanding of science, but it's much more important to have passion, to be able to communicate well, to have empathy, and to be able to individualize and critically think, not just take whatever you see on science-based YouTube and directly apply it. Um, if you're following an evidence-based plan, but it's essentially a cookie cutter for everybody, that's not evidence-based. So evidence-based practice, if we actually look at the definition of that, it's three components. It's staying up to date with the research, and then equally important, maybe not even more important, is leveraging your experience and your expertise as a coach, and also considering the personal preferences, values, and individuality of the athlete you're working with. And my advice to the athletes working with coaches is that don't put coaches on a pedestal. A good coach is there to serve and help you. You are the one in the driver's seat. You're not listening to a general or a captain or a boss. You are the key to their understanding. Sometimes people will hire me or put me on a pedestal and say, Eric, I'll do whatever you think is best. And you're not an average. You're not a study. You're not the experience I have working with the people I've worked with previously. My best source of information about what will work best for you is you. So that means that I need you to collaborate. You need to be involved. You want to see your coach as a partner and as a resource. You want to get out of them as much as you can rather than thinking passively. And sometimes coaches they'll confuse you because of the way they market. I've gotten 30 pro cards this season. It makes it sound like they're doing it, you know. But that's more of a market-driven factor. They have to market themselves to demonstrate that they know how to get people pro cards, they know how to coach with world champions. But the actual work of a good coach is not doing something for the client. It's extracting the information, building a relationship with the client, asking the right questions, and partnering with them to help create an individualized, customized plan. And the longer you work with a coach, the better that should get. You shouldn't expect to hire a great coach because, in the first season ever, they'll get you a pro card and they'll get you a world championship. No, that's something that happens over time. So that perspective, I think, is really important, and not to put science on too much of a pedestal because all those other skills are incredibly important.
Right. Awesome. If I may, could I add on to the advice to give to people?
Of course.
Um, right. I would like to tell people if you are interested to learn more about evidence-based fitness, or in terms of lifting and bodybuilding, you should come join us in a in-person seminar happening in May with Dr. Eric Helms himself.
Absolutely. I cannot wait. This is going to be my first time getting to come to Malaysia. So I'm really excited. I'm really looking forward to it. And it's not just me. We've got a host of other folks who are going to be presenting a wealth of knowledge, athletes, coaches, WNBF pros, people with far more talent as pros than me, who are going to be there to also share their experiences. So I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you guys so much for making it happen because it's going to be a really awesome opportunity for athletes, coaches, and personal trainers to kind of learn how to be better at their craft.
Awesome. Edmund, would you like to add anything before we end the podcast?
Yep. There will be release news in about 2 weeks time, I believe. Right.
Right.
We'll get all the great posters out, all the introduction and all, and further news that we'll be sharing on our social media. Yep. So stay tuned, guys.
Cool. I want to thank all the audience for tuning in and listening to the three of us, but mainly Dr. Eric Helms, sharing precious knowledge. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Dr. Eric Helms, for your time. We'll see you guys soon.